Testing, 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 testing. Is it on? Yeah, now it's on. Perfect. All right. Well, good evening. It's good to be here with you. And this is one of the most important topics I think that we can talk about. It's a very relevant topic. But before we do, I thought we could play a little game. How does that sound? A little game. All right. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you like run around, stand on your head or anything like that. So we're going to play a word association game, okay? A word association game. So this is just an example of a word association game. And in this case, they did it with a word. It's kind of small. Can you read that middle word? What does it say?
Star.
Star. Okay, so basically, what you do with the word association game is you say whatever word comes to mind associated with that center word, and then that is, so for example, in this case, it said star, there's billion, movie, like movie star, shine, dawn, moon, orbit, ray. So it's kind of interesting because it gives you an idea of what you think about that word, how you associate that word generally speaking, okay? Now, we're not going to do it with the word star. We're going to do it with another word. But before I reveal the word, the rule of this game is you can't think. You just have to say whatever comes to your mind, okay? So this is the one time I don't want you to think tonight, okay? All right, so here we go. The word is self-control. What comes to mind? Discipline. Power. Come on, don't think. Food. What? Boundaries. Temptation. Temperance. Hard. All right. And I wish I had something to write because I would write all these things down. But what you'll see often with the term self-control, and this has definitely been true in my life as well, is that it's not always the most positive connotation. Now, my brother here said power. That's positive. Someone said food. Someone said temptation, temperance. I would have probably said rigidity, no fun. Boundaries, someone said. Taking me away from what is really enjoyable. In other words, in general, when we think about the word self-control, I don't know about you, but my tendency has been in my life to be like, oh, that sounds boring. Right? Okay. So tonight, I want to challenge that perception a little bit, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So that was just a warm-up game. But first, let's talk a little bit about addiction, okay? So, has anyone ever known anyone that's been addicted? All right, we all have. We all probably have struggled from time to time with addictions of our own, right? I know I have. And one question I have for you is, what are the most popular addictions, if you will, that you see in maybe your age group or amongst your friends, colleagues, family? What are some of the things that you see? Yes? Romance, addiction to romance. and then we have also even bromance, right? No. Okay. What else? What other addictions are common? Oh, no, that's okay. Thank you, Elder. Appreciate it. What else? What's that? Social media? Uh-huh. Media. Food. Yes. What's that? Drugs, alcohol, for sure. Pornography. Yes, we're going to touch on that. What's that? Video games. Yeah, media, video games, screen time. Oh, it can be addicting. You know, speaking of the drugs and the alcohol thing, this last year, we've never had so many opioid overdose deaths. Well over 100,000. You know, it's just getting worse and worse and worse every year. It's just out of control. Illicit fentanyl, you know, plus alcohol and all these. Life expectancy in the United States, even before COVID, was already going down. And it was largely as a result of 3 reasons. Do you know what those 3 reasons were? Yeah, overdose deaths, mainly from opioids. Also, liver problems and failure and deaths from liver, which is associated, of course, with alcohol, and suicide, which is also closely related to addiction as well, and depression and other mental health problems. So, do you think addiction is a big problem? Oh, yes. Now, do you think it's a big problem just in the world? Or do you think that even within the confines of a safe place like this, there could be people that are struggling with addiction? Oh, yeah. I think we're lying to ourselves if we say, no, addiction has never touched my life and it never will touch my life. And by the way, if you're saying that, most likely you have an addictive problem, because one of the very symptoms of addiction is what? Denial. And we're not talking about the river in Egypt, right? All right. So, I know, that was a corny dad joke, but I'm a dad, so I can say that, right? All right, so what are some addiction hits? So alcohol and marijuana use. Now, this is one that people say, you know what? Weed, it's not addicting. That's what I was told when I was younger, right? It's not that bad. It's not addicting. Other drugs are addicting, but weed, it's natural, man. Yeah, it grows off a plant. You can even grow it yourself, and it's just so natural. You don't need to worry about it. You know, there's clear evidence now that marijuana is very addicting, and I see it in my practice all the time. And I will admit to you that this was actually one of my major addictions when I was an adolescent. And I struggled with this. You know, I struggled with this. And you can't tell me that this stuff is not addicting. I know it from personal experience. Plus, I see it with my patients all the time. You know, I've actually researched into this quite a bit. I have a presentation that's over 100 slides long just on the research with cannabis. And there's so much propaganda. You know how big tobacco was back in the 60s? And they were telling people like, oh yeah, it's not that bad, right? You like Philip Morris and Company, right? Oh, you know, it's not that. Cannabis is over a $20 billion a year industry, okay? So do you think there's some incentive for them to keep quiet some of the negative effects of cannabis? Oh yeah. And so you are being loaded with propaganda nowadays, not just about this and that related to COVID or whatever. It's with cannabis too. We have to be very careful. It can be very damaging. In fact, cannabis addiction can actually cause a drop in IQ, and often does, by about 7 points. Yeah. It can trigger psychosis for especially those that are vulnerable. If people are vulnerable, it has a 10-time-fold increase in psychotic symptoms. It increases depression, anxiety, and suicide attempts. So cannabis is nothing to mess with. What about tobacco use? That's pretty, everyone knows that, right? And then illicit drug use, that's pretty clear. And what about this one? Regular caffeine use. This also is an addiction hit. We're going to touch on this a little more later. And then other behavioral addictions, and we already mentioned some of these things. And you know, people could get addicted to almost anything, even if it's good. I mean, there's even people that get addicted to things like exercise, right? And anything taken into excess can actually become addictive, even if it's a good thing. And someone mentioned food earlier too, right? Food, do we need it to live? Yes. Is it a good thing? Yes. At least certain kinds of food. But it also can become a problem, right? So what are some of the common characteristics of addictions? In other words, how do we know if something's becoming a problem? Any thoughts on that? How do you know if it, especially, you know, some of these things are more subtle. I mean, it's more obvious if we know, oh, for sure, I shouldn't even touch this. But some things, yeah.
You start feeding for it?
Yes. So you start having those cravings, right? Start feeding for it. You're like, oh, man. And you're like thinking about it, can't get it out of your mind, right? I should be thinking about my homework or, sitting in church and listening. I should be listening to what the speaker's saying, but I can't wait to get home and do whatever that is, right? Yes?
When the first thing that comes to mind when whenever you stress.
Yes, that's actually a very good point. Yeah, so when we're stressed out and we're like, okay, what do I turn to? Well, the song said we should turn to Jesus, right? But maybe I feel like turning to, you fill in the blank. Absolutely. Okay, what else?
If it inhibits will.
Uh-huh.
Or completely obliterates it.
Yeah, so if it makes it difficult, like we can't control, we can't decide. It's almost like it's deciding for us, right? We're like, no, I probably shouldn't, but I just can't help it. And I think that's actually one of the keys when we know it's really starting to become a problem is when we're honest with ourselves, we're like, yeah, I shouldn't do it, but I just can't help it. It has control of me instead of I having control over it. And then we also, what's interesting is when we lose willpower in one area of our life, that actually affects willpower in other areas of our life too. And pretty soon we become slaves. And it's interesting because what the world actually calls liberty and freedom is what? Slavery. It's actually slavery. Okay, so common characteristics. So you guys did good. So overwhelming compulsion to engage in the behavior. I just can't help myself. Tolerance. This is an interesting one, right? In other words, you keep needing more to have the same effect. And we see this all the time, whether it's with video games, pornography. I mean, there's people that will start with like certain types of pornography, and they'll get into. And I'm not saying any kind of pornography is okay, but I'm saying there are different levels, and they'll get into some really weird stuff because it's not stimulating anymore, so they keep looking for more. Drinking. That's another simple example, right? You start out with just a couple drinks, it gets you kind of buzzed. Then several months later, you need like 6 drinks to have the same effect. So you start building a tolerance. Does that make sense? Okay. Dependence, so you have that withdrawal effect, and that's where you have that come down, that let down. The high tendency to relapse, feeling out of control, and the continued use despite the detrimental effect on my life. I just can't stop using. Now what's interesting is it does not matter what type of addiction it is. It doesn't matter what type of addiction it is. It stimulates the same part of the brain. Let's read this quote from Mayo Clinic. It says, as neuroscience further elucidates addiction's neural underpinnings, it becomes increasingly clear that a malfunctioning reward center is common to all compulsive behaviors, whether drug abuse, overeating, gambling, self-mutilation, or excessive sexual activity. So what that quote is saying is it doesn't matter what addictive behavior it is, it affects the same part of the brain. It's the same neural pathway, the same nerve circuit. And isn't that interesting? Even self-mutilation, what is that?
Self-harm.
Yeah, exactly. Like cutting themselves, burning themselves. Did you know that that's actually addicting? Isn't that kind of weird almost? But it is. How do you think that hurting yourself could actually become addicting? Any thoughts on it? I know it's kind of weird.
Maybe you get addicted to the hormones that your body produces.
Yes. Yeah.
Like adrenaline.
Yes, exactly. So there's dopamine, adrenaline release. Yeah, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I was going to say, I've never really got engaged in that behavior myself, even though I did some other stuff. But I did read into it a little bit. That, I guess, went to the background as to why someone would end up doing something like that. Just the emotional, either whether it's abuse or trauma that they have, they become so numb and just, there's a lot
Yes.
of, there's a lot of
Mhm.
turmoil.
Yep.
And the sensation of feeling something severe, external, like cutting themselves.
Yep.
It becomes addictive when you don't have a emotional support or affirmation, the love, all of that.
That's exactly right.
When you have a void of
It's
that, yeah.
Yeah, when you're feeling pain in different ways, whether in numbness can be pain. It can be very painful for people to feel that numbness, or there can be tremendous emotional pain. They want to feel something else, and so cutting will actually distract them. It's an escape, and like my brother here said, there are these hormones like the dopamine, the adrenaline that's released, endorphins even, and that gives people a rush. And I remember one young man. It was just, scary for me, even as a psychiatrist. I didn't even mention, I think, at the beginning, I'm a psychiatrist, right? So I work with mental health all the time. And I remember him coming to me, and he was telling me that, yeah, he cut. And remember the tolerance aspect, that you need to do more and more? He would cut deeper and deeper. And he wasn't trying to kill himself, but it was scary because he'd cut on his thighs, and I'd be like, man, when's this kid going to hit an artery, So anyway, it can be very intense. So what is that neural circuit that actually is triggered in addiction? So here we have a picture of it. And let's see, there we go. Okay. So basically, this is more in the bottom of the brain. And so there's a group of nerve cells called dopamine nerve cells. And so they project up into the emotional part of your brain. And part of the emotional part of the brain is the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is where you have that rush, that high. When dopamine stimulates this part of the brain right here, the nucleus accumbens, that's when you have that euphoric state. You're like, woo, that feels good, right? And at the same time, when dopamine is released, there's a lot of dopamine when you get high or any kind of addictive behavior right here. But there's also a lot of dopamine that's released in the frontal lobe. Now, the frontal lobe is the logical part of our brain, right? Most of us know that. So what happens is you get a bunch of dopamine dumped in the emotions, and the emotions are like, yeah, that was awesome. Let's do it again, right? That's the feeling that the emotions have. And the frontal lobe, when it gets a bunch of dopamine, the logical part of your brain actually shuts down. It decreases in activity. And so what happens then? So what happens then is it creates an imbalance. So the emotional part of your brain is like, yeah, let's do that again. And the frontal lobe, the logical part, is like, no, don't do it. It's a bad idea. Who's going to win that argument? The loud voice, right? The one that's yelling for more. And now you can start to understand why it is so difficult to get out of addiction. Does that make sense? Because your emotions are screaming for more, and even though there's part of you that knows this isn't good for me, I shouldn't keep doing this, you don't have the ability to control those emotions. They're out of control. And so that's why we often need an external frontal lobe, an external help to actually get out of addiction, right? And that's why things like 12-step programs work. That's why it's so important to connect with a higher power, because we need help from outside of ourselves, because now we become our worst enemy when we start in this addiction cycle. And if we think that we can just white knuckle it and do it on our own and by ourselves, we're kidding ourselves. It becomes very difficult. And I've seen people white knuckle it, and you can sometimes do it for a while, but this is what we kind of see as the dry drunk, so to speak. Have you ever seen people like this where they're like, I'm not drinking alcohol, and I'm never going to do it again, and they're just like angry and bitter, and they're not truly free? And I'm like, hey, can I buy you a drink? Because you need it. No, not really. But, they're so uptight. And that's not the type of true freedom that we want. So that's why it's important when we're in that addictive pathway to get help. And so we call that bottom-up regulation as opposed to top-down regulation. So instead of being controlled by reason and logic, we're controlled by our emotions. And guess what? This is actually what's happening, not just specifically with addictions, but we see this through our society more and more. Have you noticed that more and more people in society are getting controlled more and more by their emotions rather than by reason and logic? Do you think that's by design?
Yep.
Absolutely. Because I'll tell you this, that God is what? A God of truth, right? And so God meets us he says, come, let us reason together, right? God is the God of truth. He's not against emotion, but his primary way of reaching us is first through our intellect, through the higher center of the mind. And when our higher center of our mind gets disturbed, and when the lower center, the emotional part of our mind, gets hyperactivated, we cannot actually connect very clearly with God. We actually literally start drowning out his voice. And isn't that exactly what Satan wants today? And that's why there is so many things to overstimulate that emotional part of our brain and shut down the logical frontal lobe, because Satan wants to do everything he can to prevent us from hearing the voice of God and from hearing his voice instead. This is a serious topic. So, everyone's usually with me up until then, and then I do this, right? But it's true. Caffeine actually is addicting. It is a stimulant, and so it does overstimulate that emotional part of our brain. It actually also reduces the blood flow to the brain by an average of 30%. And people always want to know, okay, how many cups of coffee does it take? 2 cups of coffee, so 12, and by definition, a cup of coffee is 6 ounces, not 8. And so that means 12 ounces of coffee will actually reduce your blood flow to your brain by 30%. So it's kind of like this. It will, think about it this way. If you had a horse and you told that horse to run faster and run harder, and you beat it with a stick, but you said, I'm going to give you less water and food to do that, do you think that horse would get tired after a while? But that's what we do to our brains with caffeine. We beat our brain, our body, and say, work harder, work faster, but I'm going to give you, what does the blood flow carry to the brain? It carries oxygen and glucose, right? Nutrients. And so if our brain cells are not getting the oxygen and nutrients, they're working harder, they're working faster, but they start short-circuiting and getting tired out. And that's exactly what happens over time. The longer people use caffeine, the more tired they actually become. The studies are very clear with that. And people get irritable, and your brain will start malfunctioning. Not a good thing. Gambling also reduces activity in the rational mind. You go step into a casino. What's in a casino? All these lights, all this noise, and what do they bring you for free? Have another drink. Do you think that drink might impair your rational thinking? Why? It's perfectly set up so that you lose self-control. So your rational mind is shut down, and so that your emotions are stimulated, and you stay there as long as possible in kind of this mesmerized haze, almost like mildly hypnotic state. Just keep like a monkey, okay, the slot machine, just another, right? Just got to get those 3 bananas or those 3 cherries or whatever it is, right? And it can be very addicting. And what about media addiction? Some people mentioned that earlier, right? Media is very addicting. It's actually, the way they've created it is to be more and more addicting. Television scientists have discovered that the quicker you have edits, in other words, the more scene changes, the more it jumps from one scene to the next, the more dopamine it will actually stimulate. So that grabs your attention, but guess what it does to your frontal lobe? It shuts it down. So the more scene changes it has from one to the next, you get more and more interested because it's new and it's fascinating and all of that, but the frontal lobe shuts down more and more, the logical part of your brain. And this is a big part of why people's attention spans have gone down drastically over the last several years, because they're used to that constant stimulation of the emotional part of your brain. I mean, you all are doing amazing, really, because I can tell you're all with me. But, most people have such a difficult time nowadays paying attention to something that goes on for more than 5 minutes. It's pretty sad. So Robert Lustig, a professor of pediatrics focused on endocrinology at the University of Southern California, authored a book called The Hacking of the American Mind. He says, it's not a drug, but it might as well be. It works the same way, it has the same results. And then, this was an interesting study. In 2011, the military conducted a study using Snow World, a cartoon virtual reality game set in the Arctic ice where a series of penguins march back and forth to treat pain in soldiers. Now, can you just imagine these toughened soldiers, right? They're in pain. And what are they doing? Playing a virtual reality game with penguins marching back and forth on the Arctic ice. Do you think that's going to help their pain? Well, in this study, it actually showed that for those in the most severe pain, Snow World worked even better than morphine. Why is that? Well, because of the amazingly strong stimulation that it has on our emotions, on our endorphins, on our dopamine, all of this. Nicholas Kardaras, PhD, a leading expert on kids and digital addiction, says that brain imaging research is showing that glowing screens like those of iPads are as stimulating to the brain's pleasure center and is able to increase levels of dopamine as much as sex does. This brain orgasm effect is what makes screens so addictive for adults, but even more so for children with still developing brains that just aren't equipped to handle that level of stimulation. Isn't that amazing? And it's sad to me because I think about our children and I'm like, do they even have a chance, you know? Right? Because you're exposed to this from an early age. So your brain is getting wired for these unnatural rewards rather than natural rewards. And definitely not for supernatural rewards the way that God wants it to be, right? In other words, a lot of kids can't even appreciate reality because this is so much more interesting. And even some of us start to become numb to like a beautiful sunset or to an interaction with a friend or what, you know, you fill in the blank, a sermon. Whatever it might be, that's actually good for us and should stimulate us and be like, oh, that's interesting. But it's not so interesting because, you know what? The brain has become numb. It's become desensitized from being overstimulated by all this stuff. Yes?
Do you think this point that you're making here, because we basically have a generation that, you know, our phones have pretty much replaced our Bibles even.
Yes.
In the church, we're using way more electronics to read scripture, etc., than just using the plain old black and white paper book. Can this effect also take place, or is it taking place while people are using, you know, the electronics just to read scripture?
It's a good question, and I think the effect would be minimal because, now I'm not saying that there's not something to that as far as like, let me put it this way. There are studies that clearly show that reading actual paper is better. You get better understanding, better retention than doing it with a computer or an iPhone, etc. But I'll say it's a lot minimal compared to like your normal media, because again, the big thing with media is that it's jumping from one screen to the next. So, you know, if you're just reading a Bible on your iPhone, it's not nearly as bad, but it's still not the ideal. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Is that more so an example of the relationship to the phone that you just use?
Yes, and that's the other part, right? It just strengthens that attachment to the phone. Like, where's my, man, I'll be honest, you know, I get anxious sometimes if I lose my phone because there's so many things that I have with that, my contacts and blah, 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 and it's not backed up to the iCloud. Anyway, all right, so now I'm getting really nervous just thinking about that. So pornography, you know, pornography has been one of these things that's just taken off in recent years, and it's very sad because I think a lot of the reason it's taken off is because we are starving for real relationship. you know? But then, of course, the pornography use will, and over-sexualizing our society then makes it more difficult to have a genuine, real relationship with one another. But I think a lot of it is because people are truly lonely, you know, deep down. And so they're looking for some kind of connection. And this is a replacement, you know, a faux connection, if you will, but it's not the real thing. And so it can do terrible things. And even in our church, it is very common for people to struggle with pornography. And this is one of the most difficult things for people to actually break out of. And it does often require specialized intervention. You know, it really does. And it's so easy to fall into this trap because there are so many sexualized images that we see all around us. And even, you know, the way that people dress can be very provocative. And so it can, especially if someone already has a problem with that, it can become a trigger. You know, and you can't just walk around with your eyes closed all the time. And so this often requires some real specialized treatment. And then what about an acceptable addiction? Research is revealing that sugar and sweet reward can not only substitute to addictive drugs like cocaine, but can even be more rewarding and attractive. At the neurobiological level, the neural substrates of sugar and sweet reward appear to be more robust than those of cocaine. Now, this was actually done on mice and rat studies, okay? And they found that there was, a huge release of dopamine when they got that sugar hit. And so this is, even for, you know, some of us Adventists, this can hit home, right? What about some of us junk food vegans, right? It can, it can really overstimulate. And I'll tell you, this, you know, we used to talk about cannabis being kind of the gateway drug, right? I think sugar is actually the gateway drug in reality. And I'll say this, you know, it's just ironic, you know, even when I was a little kid, we would go to I remember being a little kid and I'd save my allowance, my $1 a week, and I couldn't wait for Dad to stop by at the gas station so I could get those Red Hots and those Sweet Tarts and all of that candy. And it was like I was feeding for it. And then the ironic thing is when I'd open those little boxes, it would have these little messages. This was back in the 1980s, you know, with the war against drugs, and it would say things like, say nope to dope. And drugs will kill you or whatever. But it was ironic because, of course, it's telling you don't do these things, but sugar is actually a gateway. All right. So we have to be very careful. So let's get back to our little word game that we played earlier with self-control. And when we started, we talked about how, you know, we often think of self-control in a negative way, like that it's no fun, it's rigid, it's going to keep us from experiencing life and liberty. So where did our misunderstanding of pleasure come from? Where did our misunderstanding of pleasure come from? Well, I'd go as far as to say that it started from the beginning. You know, this is a picture, an artist's, you know, rendition of the Garden of Eden. And you can just imagine, I mean, this is actually a very beautiful picture when you stop and look at it. Yeah, look at it, you know, just Jesus there with Adam and Eve, you know, the animals. Wow. I mean, amazing. You can't think of a better place, right? And actually, one of the definitions of Eden is pleasure. So God created man, and he put them in this garden, the garden of pleasure. Beautiful, right? And he said, I want to give you freedom to do anything you want here, anything that your heart desires, except one thing. There's one tree, and this, I'm going to, you know, test your loyalty to me. And, you know, if they didn't have that choice, then they wouldn't have freedom, right? And if there's no freedom, there's no love, right? So he gave them that choice. And of course, we all know what happened. So Eve wanders away from Adam's side. She gets close to that tree, and she sees this beautiful serpent. Now, what did that serpent actually tell her? Does anyone remember And we could even, why don't we just look it up real quick? Could someone look it up in Genesis chapter 3? I don't remember the exact verse, but I know you can find it. And if someone could read what the serpent, that dialogue between the serpent and Eve. All right, whoever would, yes, go ahead.
Then the serpent said to the woman, "You will not surely die, for God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil."
All right, and go ahead and finish that section there.
So when the woman saw the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate.
Okay, thank you. So what did the serpent say there to her? He told her what? A lie, yes. And what was that lie? You're not surely going to die. And what else did he say about what was going to happen what was the reward?
It would be wise.
Your eyes are going to be open and you're going to be like God. Now the ironic thing is, man and women, Adam and Eve were already created what? In the image of? So were they already like God? Yes, right? But somehow he was saying you're going to become even more like God. You're going to become even more elevated. You're going to experience an even higher state of existence. Do you see the promise there? In other words, God is withholding something even better from you. And if you wander outside of his will, you're going to experience a state of existence and ecstasy that you've never experienced before. And if you don't do it now, you might not get a chance to do it later. Do you see the promise there? And that's continued to be the promise ever since then. In other words, Satan is continuing to allure us and say, you know what? Don't follow what he's trying to withhold fun from you. And if you do what you want, then you're going to be happy. But if you stay, then you're really going to, learn what freedom and joy means, right? But if you stay in his law and follow that, you're actually going to have no fun at all. That's the continued lie. And there we see, I don't know why it's always an apple that gets blamed, but anyway. So, and what do we actually call this? We call this hedonism. Hedonism. Hedonism is the pursuit of pleasure and sensual enjoyment, saying, you know what, I want to do what I feel like. Follow your heart, all right? Follow what feels good in the moment. It's the casting off of all moral restraint. It's saying, I don't care what the law says. I don't care what the rules are. I want to do what feels good now. And if I follow my heart, that's going to be what makes me happy. Right? But that's actually a huge lie. Even secular society. There was an article in GQ magazine a while ago. 10 reasons why you should quit watching porn. Even secular people are realizing addiction's not all it's cracked up to be. And that's the way it is with all sin. One of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis, said, for any happiness, even in this world. By the way, C.S. Lewis used to be an atheist. Very amazing guy. The guy that wrote Chronicles of Narnia and Mere Christianity, the Screwtape Letters. For any happiness, even in this world, quite a lot of restraint is going to be necessary. Every sane and civilized man must have some sort of principles by which he chooses to reject some of his desires and to permit others. So what he's saying is, if you want to have greater joy, you actually have to have certain rules for yourself, certain principles to follow so that you can experience that. I mean, very simple. Think about it this way. Yeah, self-control, right? Think about it this way. If I want to have a great day tomorrow, then am I going to just say, you know what? I don't care if I feel like eating this whole gallon of ice cream tonight. So I'm just going to do it. Yum, 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 right? Well, what would after that? I'd probably be on the toilet half the night, and I would not wake up feeling very good, and I'd have a terrible day. So the point here is, if I say, okay, you know what? I'm just going to have a little bit. Now, am I exercising restraint? Yes. Am I saying no to an immediate gratification desire? Yes. But does that set the stage for greater happiness in the long run? Yes. Do you see how this works? Yes, there are certain rules, but our net happiness is so much greater. And that's why when we talk about self-control, we should start understanding that this sets the stage for true happiness, the greatest amount of net happiness that we can possibly have. And so instead of practicing hedonism, I want us to learn to practice Hedonism, okay? So you can think of, instead of self-control, you can think of the term hedonism. All right, so overcoming addictions requires the understanding of temperance. What is temperance? Does anyone know? What is temperance? What's that? That is right on. And I heard moderation, which is true for those things that are good, but it is exactly what Elder said, which is abstaining completely from those things that are harmful. You've heard this call for moderation, right? Moderation in all things is the common slogan. So why should we abstain completely from the unhealthy? Why should we abstain completely? Because again, it's this idea of like, no, it's okay to have a little bit. Why should we not do that? Poison is poison, right? Just have a little bit of poison. Come on, a little cyanide. Come on. Don't you want a little bit? Yeah.
It helps preventing habits.
That's right. Exactly. Because even a little bit can start to train our minds to need a little bit more. That's right. And we start to enjoy that, and it becomes a very slippery slope. So, because it is unhealthy, because poison is poison, and second, because of the addictive nature of unhealthy substances. You both hit it right on the head. And you know, sometimes, let's say someone says, okay, I'm giving up smoking, and they give up smoking, but they're like, you know what, I'm just going to do this like once a week, okay, just one cigarette once a week. How much do you think they think about that golden cigarette once a week? You know what I mean? Like now, but hey, I'm doing better. But in their mind, are they truly free? No. In a lot of ways, it's actually become an even bigger idol. Because now I can't wait for that special cigarette. And when that comes, it's like, oh, it's so glorious. Do you see what I'm saying? You're still just as addicted in your mind, and sometimes more, because now you've idolized it even more. Does that make sense? Very dangerous. All right, so this is my final slide. The 8-step plan to overcome addiction. See, I was able to take AA's 12-step. Here's a competition, right? Get it down to 8. No, I'm just kidding. This is actually not to try to compete with AA. This is just some simple principles that I've learned that are very helpful over the years. And actually, it complements like 12-step programs in helping people overcome addiction. So the first step is making a firm commitment to quit. So, of course, even in order to get there, you have to recognize that you have a problem, right? And that sometimes takes a while. It takes hitting rock bottom. But then once you realize, okay, this is an issue for me, I want to overcome this, you got to make a firm commitment to quit. And then the second thing is you got to set a quit date. So don't just say, okay, I'm going to quit for sure. You need to have a specific goal of when you're going to do that. And now for some that are dangerous addictions, yeah, it should be right away, you know. But I often do see people trying to quit. They make these big promises to God and to themselves and everyone else, like, I'm going to quit today, blah, blah, blah. But they don't set a plan in place for them to be successful. okay? So oftentimes it's actually helpful to set that quit date maybe a week from now. Give yourself some time to actually get a plan together, which brings us to number 3. During this time of waiting, before your quit date, you want to write down your triggers and your replacements. And so basically, to make this very simple, in one column, and Elder, maybe I should have had you bring that. I think I can explain it. But yeah, so in one column, you want to write down all your triggers. For example, okay, let's say, what's an addiction? Just tell me any addiction. Food. Okay, so, well, let's use something, that'll be a little more difficult. Alcohol. Okay, that's a little easier. Yeah, let's use alcohol. So what are some triggers for using alcohol for people?
Going to the bar to self-collect.
Okay, so going to the bar. Good. So that's one trigger. Stress is another trigger. So you want to write down all these triggers in one column. Okay, so this would be your left-hand column, all of your triggers. 1, 2, 3, 4, stress, going to a bar, getting in fights with my spouse, the dog peeing on the floor, whatever. So all of these things are triggers for me, okay? And then what you want to do is actually, of course, so then that's in the one column. And then in the other column, in the right column, for every trigger, you want to find at least 2 replacements. So going back to the stress one, for example, what do we do to cope with stress instead of alcohol? Does that make sense? Because you don't want to just take something away and then leave a void. You have to find a replacement. And that was the way that Christ worked with people. He didn't just take things away. He didn't just say, don't do this, this is bad, this is bad. No, he always pointed them to what? To something better. And that's what we want to do with ourselves too, okay? So we want to actually find better ways of coping with stress, and you want to have at least 2, because, for example, if one of your stress coping mechanisms is going outside on a walk, but it's raining, then you're going to be like making excuses, right? So you want to have a couple things on there, a couple options. And so then when you, of course, you want to avoid the triggers. So if you're an alcoholic, then you want to avoid, like you said, the bar, right? But you can't avoid all your triggers, but you want to avoid the obvious ones. You don't want to set yourself up for failure. And when you are triggered, you look at your list and you engage in something better. Number 6, get outside support and accountability. Remember, we need that external frontal lobe, that external support. We can't do it by ourselves. There's no shame in this. We need to support one another. We all have our struggles. And the tendency is for us to be like, nope, I don't have any problems. I'm fine. I got this. Me and God. And you know what? It's wonderful when we can do it, me and God. But a lot of times God puts people in our lives to support us on the journey. And that's okay. We all have our struggles. We all have our weaknesses. Number 7, reflect on what you are gaining an attitude, by having an attitude of gratitude. I did this, and I know it sounds almost silly, but when I quit smoking cigarettes, I told myself, okay, I know I'm going to have cravings, but when I have those cravings, I'm actually going to tell myself, yes, I'm thankful I'm having this craving because it's reminding me that I'm becoming free. And at first it just felt so corny and awkward and like I was just like, ah. But then pretty soon because I realized, this is the truth. This is the truth, even though it feels awkward and corny because I'm not feeling it yet. But pretty soon I really started feeling it. I really started being grateful, and I would start seeing people and I'd be like, yeah, I kind of want one, but boy, I'm glad I'm not a slave to that anymore, And so when the triggers came out, instead of just being like, oh, I wish I could have one, I would be like, no, I'm glad I don't need to have one anymore. I'm grateful I'm being set free. And then finally, identify and treat underlying causes. Identify and treat underlying causes. There are reasons that we are prone to addictions. There are holes in our life. There are wounds. We have to understand, why is it that I am actually attracted to certain addictive behaviors? And we have to solve those underlying issues. And next week, I'm scheduled to be back, and that's really what we're going to focus on next week, is what are some of those underlying issues that can actually trigger us, that can leave a hole in our hearts so that we're not being fulfilled the way that we need to be fulfilled, so then we easily turn to addictions. All right, well, I don't know if there's any questions, comments, but that's all I had for you to share with you this evening. And, you know, the one last thing I'll leave you with is that God understands our struggles. You know, he doesn't condemn us. We all have our weaknesses. And when we come to him and we just admit to him, we say, God, you know, I need your help. And I can't do this by myself. And I'm struggling even to hear your voice and to feel you with me right now. But I'm open to you helping me. I'm open to you sending me the right people. God will send you the right people. He'll put you in the right circumstances. He'll guide you. He wants you to be free. And he doesn't condemn you. Jesus says, he who comes to me, I will in no wise cast out. He's waiting for each one of us with his arms of love. And you know, I have to come to him every day because we all have these struggles. And I'll go as far as to say, I think all sin is actually addicting. All right. Any questions or comments before we finish? Okay. Yes.
Even though you'll be done, Daniel, by next week as far as even though you'll be done by next week's presentation, you know, this represents probably a fraction, a portion of the young adult ministry that normally would come together. We would love to know, what recommendations can you give of how we can be an encouragement or play some role of accountability to one another, to hold each other up
Yes.
in the event that we're battling with addictions. Not necessarily, you know, putting our private business together,
Right.
but just how can we as a group of young adults help each other? That doesn't have to be something you answer tonight, but definitely, if you don't mind, by next week, to kind of say, hey, here's some things you guys can do now that I'll be gone, but here's some things you can do in the event there's still these type of battles going on in our lives.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that comment and question. I think it's a very important point. And yeah, I don't think I'm going to completely try to answer right now, but I will say that I do think small groups can be very helpful. I do think 12-step models based on a higher power of Jesus Christ, you know, not just the God of our understanding, can be very helpful and a wonderful ministry actually to, you know, open the doors of the church even for people struggling anywhere in our communities. And so, you know, that's even something that we're looking at. How can we start something along those lines even at our practice? Because we just see the huge need that's out there for that kind of support. So, yeah.
I had a question about one of the slides where you had the up and down versus the down and up.
The bottom up versus the
bottom up, yeah, versus
bottom or top down.
Top down. My question is, do you see a scenario in which the bottom up would be advantageous in any way?
Yes, that's actually a very good question. So there are occasional times where that can be an advantage. It's primarily when someone is under acute stress and they've been very well trained. Now let me explain further. So let's say, for example, that you have firefighters or paramedics, and they go to the scene of an accident, and they're under a lot of stress, right? I mean, it's stressful. And so under that stress, their frontal lobes, their logical part of their brain, actually will tend to shut down, at least partially. But they've trained so often and so hard for these sorts of situations, that they can often perform even better under those periods of stress because they know the right thing to do, and they have that extra energy to do it. Another example would be like Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant, right? So these are people, they practice so much, like they can do things in game time that they would never be able to do in practice because they were trained so hard, so long, that even though they're stressed in those tight games or whatnot, they rise to the occasion because their habits have been so well trained. But in general, we want to outside of kind of those exceptions, there's not a lot of advantages. I mean, really, we want to be allowing our frontal lobe to control. But of course, we're all going to be faced with acute stress from time to time. So it's important that we train ourselves to do the right thing so that when we are under those acutely stressful situations, we can rise to the occasion and still do the right thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think, did you have a question?
I was kind of struggling a little bit on how to word this actually because it's kind of, I'm zeroing on number 8 right there, identifying and treat underlying causes. And the reason I'm zeroing in on that is because I did used to engage in a lot of, like yourself, smoking marijuana for a good long time. But in all that time, and even now today, I still I'm reluctant and I'm still hesitant and I still kind of disagree with the description that I was addicted to it. Because, and the reason why I say that, and I just want to see if there's room for emphasizing number 8 there, I still kind of do not believe that I was because of the reason that I was doing it. It didn't matter if it was going to be marijuana or food or social media, whatever, any addiction in and of itself. I was just going to say, emphasizing the underlying cause, do you think that's just much more paramount than whatever the addictive addiction it is?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, often we're really more addicted to escape. We just like to escape in different ways, Some people like to escape into this sort of feeling, and other people like to escape in this sort of feeling. And so the addiction is really because we don't want to deal with the pain.
Yeah. And I guess the second part as to why I want to emphasize that is because there is just so much stigma on the visual habit that someone, it's a negative, detrimental, ruinous habit. None can argue against that. But there's just so much stigma against the external visual habit that the person is engaging in, while neglecting that the overarching reason that someone is doing that is because they're just empty inside, coping.
There's a woundedness,
Yeah,
absolutely.
exactly.
And that's why we have to be very careful not to judge, but we want to say, you know what, because right now, it's kind of like someone is drowning in this ocean and all they've had is to hang on to this little piece of driftwood, and maybe that's the cannabis, right? Yeah. But then instead of just being like, you need to let go of that driftwood, well, what are they going to have? Nothing. Instead, you need to bring them a lifeboat and say, come in the lifeboat. I have something much better for you, right? So I appreciate what you're saying there. Yes, absolutely.
Hello. One question. As a psychiatrist, do you have any advice for individuals that within their circle of influence, friends or family members, that maybe not getting what it is they say they want out of life, or they have something unhealthy escapisms or coping mechanisms, and they've yet to get to the point where they've identified those as a problem for them? And oftentimes, you don't want to invalidate people's experience, right? Because their perception is their reality. How would you go about approaching someone that is yet to realize that their lifestyle might be getting into the way of whether it be happiness or goals, to, point that out without, hopefully making sure that they don't feel attacked or anything like that?
Yeah, no, working with minds is the most delicate work that we can do. And I think, the first step is always making sure that we have established a trusting relationship. They know that we really care about them, And then once they know that we really care about them, well, we have to always make sure that we're not enabling their behavior. We're not saying it's okay. But at the same time, letting them know that no matter what they do, we still love them, but we can't always condone, what they're doing. We can't just agree and say, oh yeah, it's fine. And sometimes we might even, and we have to be very prayerful about this with the right timing and circumstances and the right words. But there is definitely a place to come to people and say, because I do love you, I want to share my concerns, And if you have that sort of relationship with them and they're willing to at least hear you out, it may not seem like it makes a difference right away, but over time, it can often set a seed in their mind. And then the Lord can bring other circumstances and people to water that seed. Sometimes they hit rock bottom and they'll remember and they'll be like, you know what? But, sooner or later people have to come to that realization, like, this is just not working for me anymore. It's not bringing that fulfillment and happiness, and I need to try something different. Yeah. Yes?
When I used to do a lot of extensive traveling, I used to carry all the books that I would read and reference from. Started to suffer terrible back pain because my back was extremely heavy. So I said, all right, well, let me go ahead and get an iPad. And I bought an iPad and I downloaded lots of ebooks of the very books that I would carry with me. And I'm using this for what I do. So it's like there's a lot of times I had to reference and read or whatever. So now it was way more practical because I'm holding just one tablet with 1,000 books on it versus trying to carry 1,000 books on my back. So is there a recommendation? Like, hey, if you do e-reading, studies have shown this much time on an electronic for e-reading is safe. This much time on electronic e-reading is dangerous. That is a really important question for me. So just let me know what you think.
Yeah, so I think the basic answer there is, like, when we're perusing through as far as like doing some more, I'll say, superficial, like reading as far as like trying to figure out, like, what are we really trying to reference, and putting ideas together and doing research, so to speak. I don't think it's a problem. Actually, I think it can be a big advantage. But when we really want to like digest something and really take the time to marinate in it, it is better. I'm not saying it's impossible to get it deep if it's not on a printed page, right? But it is going to be easier and better. You are going to tend to really digest it more if you have it there in your hands and you can, it's on that printed page. I don't think there's any real studies that I know of, and there might be, as far as time and all of that, but that's, the kind of general guidelines that I would suggest. So, when it comes to like reading for my devotions, then I try to read, the printed page. But when I'm doing like research for something and I know that kind of the ideas and the direction, then I'm like, yeah, I want to use online or, electronic media because I can do it so much more quickly. And I think, to me, that's okay, but, everyone needs to figure out where their line is.
In regards to caffeine, is there a medicinal use for it?
There's very little evidence. The Parkinson's disease, there's some argumentation that perhaps it could help, but even with that, there was studies that showed that you would have to drink loads of it, and then when you compare the potential benefit, small benefit in Parkinson's with all the potential negative effects, especially with a lot of caffeine, there really is no proven benefits. They like to make certain claims, but when you look at the preponderance of evidence, the body of research, there's actually no evidence that caffeine's healthful in any way.
For adults, a lot of us spend a lot of time on our electronics, sometimes late into the evening. Sometimes, unfortunately, possibly even early in the morning. Can you specify what are some of the challenges, what are some of the problems that we could invite on ourselves by this overexposure of electronic usage?
Yeah, so I have several lectures just on media and the brain, and the challenges are very significant. It's very clear that there's a huge correlation between the influx of media and even right around 2011, when the majority of Americans actually started owning their own smartphones, that's where we had an explosion of mental health problems, especially in the teenage population. And so it significant, and by the way, people always want to know, well, what's the cutoff numbers here? So generally speaking, over an hour and a half of entertainment media for adults is where you really start having problems. The average American, how many hours do you think the average American engages in entertainment media?
4 to 5.
It's actually over 11 hours a day, okay? Now I will say that does count radio, which is about 90 minutes on average, but still over 9 hours a day.
So real quick,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
entertainment media side, TikTok, Instagram,
Yeah.
all of those, that's part of the
Right,
entertainment
so
media.
it's social media, it's
Okay.
television, it's movies, it's anything screen time, but it does not count like work, on the computer. It doesn't count school on the computer. It doesn't count all screen time. That's entertainment media, okay? And so it increases the risk of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, aggression and violence. In older people, it increases risk of dementia, cognitive problems. Younger people, ADHD. It also, just from a physiological standpoint, it does exactly what any addiction does, right? Which is shut down the logical part of our brain, overstimulates the emotional part of our brain. It makes us less sensitive to real life rewards, and the list goes on.